Welcome to FOBtv, the future of business. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict. I'm a futurist here at TCS, and I want to wish everyone Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy Holidays, no matter what you call them. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited to have Byron Reese back. He's a futurist and author. One of the books last year that I read for the first time that I really loved was a book by Byron called Stories, Dice, and Rocks That Think. Just fascinating book. I would encourage any of you to read that. And Byron, what are your books you've written up till that point as well?
The first book I wrote was called Infinite Progress, where I tried to figure out why we had two different narratives of the future that were so different. And what did I think? And then I wrote a philosophy book on artificial intelligence called The Fourth Age. I'm not supposed to say it's a philosophy book because that evidently does not supercharge sales. Then after that, I wrote a book with a friend of mine called Wasted, which was a science book about waste. Then I wrote the one you mentioned, and then I have this new book out called We Are Agora.
We Are Agora, and that's going to be our primary topic today. So thanks for sharing all of that. And by the way, I love your writing style. It's phenomenal. It's easy to read. I just love it. It's conversational. So thank you. So let's jump right into this. Now, you talk a lot about this concept of superorganisms in your new book. I think before we dive into this, let's talk about that concept. What is a superorganism? And then how does that apply to humanity?
So a superorganism is a creature made up of other creatures. And that is a simple sentence to say, but an incredibly difficult concept to grasp. For instance, each of your cells is alive. It's a living creature. Mm-hmm. And yet there's also you, and you're not a roommate with your cells. It's not like they get half the body and you get half the body. Somehow your cells and you exist in the same actual physical matter. You're superimposed on each other. Now, with some creatures, it goes up another level. Those creatures themselves come together and they form another organism. When I was a boy, I was a Boy Scout, and I went to Boy Scout camp, but I was also a big nerd. I saw a nerdy merit badge that I could take, and it was bookkeeping. And I said, I would like to go to summer camp and learn accounting. So I signed up for bookkeeping, and I showed up, and the instructor came out and said there was no such thing as a bookkeeping merit badge, that we had all signed up for beekeeping. And that is a story of how I became a beekeeper. And what I learned is that a beehive is actually an animal, different, and the bees are like its cells. Not a metaphor. It has a memory of its own. It regulates its own body temperature. It holds its temperature at 97 degrees, whereas a bee doesn't hold its body temperature at anything. It has a long lifespan. A bee only lives 6 weeks, but the hive can live 100 years. And there may be enough activity going on there that it is an intelligent life form. There's an old tradition called the telling of the bees, that when a beekeeper dies, you're supposed to go out there and tell the hive the beekeeper has passed away. And I believe they did that to the royal hives when Queen Elizabeth passed away. And they went and told the bees that there is some kind of an intelligence. So to sum all of that, to the point of all of that is, if cells come together and make creatures, and creatures come together and make superorganisms, it's possible that people in aggregate form a living creature, not a metaphor, nothing touchy-feely, just in a purely biological sense. Is it possible that a group of people, a large enough group of people, becomes its own intelligence, becomes its own creature? I think it is true. I think I can scientifically show it, and I gave it a name, and that name is agora. Agora was the marketplace in ancient Greece where all human activity happened, all the debating and all the buying and selling and all the activity. And it was that energy that I was trying to capture with this name.
So if this is biological, that goes beyond the concept of zeitgeist or something like this. This is something much bigger than that, isn't it?
It's an actual animal which has emergent capabilities. It can do things no person can do. There was an essay that was written a long time ago called I, Pencil, the letter I, comma, pencil. And it pointed out that nobody knows how to make a pencil. There's not a soul on this planet who could fell the tree and mine the lead and make the ferrule. And you can say the same about a smartphone. Smartphone has 60 different elements in it. Your body only has 30, but a smartphone has 60. And there's not a human being alive who can make a smartphone, yet they get made. That isn't I think Agora makes them. I think that's who's making them. I think that's who knows how to make them. Yeah, I think it's actually a real creature. And I think it answers the question of why we are here, which science, I'm a science writer, and science does not like why questions. Science likes how questions, when questions, what questions, but why? It tries to change the subject on those as quickly as it can. And I think if I'm right about Agora, I know why it's here, and I know why, by extension, we're here.
Oh my, this is awesome. What a teaser on that one. So let me ask you this question. We talked before we started recording about, kind of the process of coming up with new ideas for books, but how did you come up with this idea?
Really, it has been in the back of my head ever since I was a boy and raised those bees. And I would watch when they would swarm. Once a year, the bees would swarm and they go find a new home. And there's this really elaborate process and all of that, which is mind-boggling when you realize none of the bees have ever done it before. None of them. The bees are only a few weeks old. And they're doing things at different angles and evaluating different homes and coming back and recruiting other people to go check those homes out. And then they're signaling to the other ones when a decision is made, which is when there's a critical mass of bees who all agree. All of that's going on, and yet none of those bees knows what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. Their brains are about half the size of a grain of salt. They don't know what they're doing. And yet they do this incredibly intelligent thing. And you can't help but to think about that and then find yourself in a city and look around that city and realize that it too is able to do things that no person can. Like New York City has 10,000 tons of food that are delivered to it every day. And it's got tens of thousands of restaurants, and they all need flour for bagels and pizzas. And you say, well, who's deciding what goes where, and balancing it all with the cod catch and all of this, and who's deciding where the Ubers are and where the taxis are hanging out and all of that? And of course the answer is nobody's deciding that. It is something that is happening because the individual people, a restaurant manager is just reordering for their menu. They're running their little algorithms the way a bee would, but it at some level becomes collectively a much more intelligent thing. And then you have to say, well, it has a lifespan, it has things that it wants, it has proclivities, and that it's an actual animal. And so then the last thing I'll say is science likes to make falsifiable hypotheses. If there is this creature, Agora, what predictions could I make that somebody else could falsify? And so I started making a series of those that I go through in the book and invite other people to falsify them.
Oh, I love it, love it, love it. So how does viewing humanity then as this single superorganism help it address some of the big challenges that we have? Everything from the pandemic to climate change and all that. How does that idea fit with that?
Well, that's the question. We tend to think that our fate, I think people think this, that our fate hinges on a few people, the power people, the people whose names we all know, and the rest of us are kind of along for the ride. But I don't think this is how it works at all. The biggest gear in the clock isn't the one that is keeping time. It's all the gears working together. Let me say it this way. Right after World War II, there was a man who committed suicide in San Francisco by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And he was in his mid-30s. Didn't really have any particular problems. It wasn't like a health thing. And it so happened there was a psychologist who studied suicide at Stanford at the time. And he said, I'm going to go check that out. And he went to that guy's apartment. And it turned out he had left a note. Even though he lived alone, he left a note for whoever happened to find it. And the note said, I'm going to walk to the bridge now. If one person smiles at me along the way, I will not jump. And I actually think that's it. I don't think the world is changed by the power people and everybody else is being dragged along. I think it is shaped and changed by smiling at the guy walking towards the bridge. I think it simultaneously, it takes the pressure off in a way that you basically should just, Aldous Huxley said on his deathbed, he said, after 45 years of study, I'm embarrassed to say about the only conclusion I have is we should all try to be a little nicer to each other. And I don't think he should have been embarrassed to say that at all. I think it's a wonderful conclusion. And you see, the beehive doesn't work because there's one like super bee and everybody else just sitting around. The bee works because everybody goes out and does their thing. And I actually think you build utopia by a billion acts of kindness done by a billion people.
Wow. So in your book, you discuss these tensions between individuality and collective behavior in human societies. So how can we balance these in today's increasingly interconnected world?
Well, in a superorganism, the parts often exhibit behavior which is not in their own self-interest, but in the interest of the whole. A bee will sting an attacker that's threatening the hive, even though the bee is going to die doing it. And that's actually part of the thesis, is that humans, if we are a superorganism, humans would tend to do that, to do things that are individually irrational, but good for the whole. And that's altruism, right? And Darwin always had a big problem with it. Like he's like, I really can't figure that one out. Why is it that people are altruistic? So you have these, screaming monkeys that warn when creatures are coming. And every monkey benefits with the screamer, but it's always a threat to the one doing, that one draws attention to itself. Mm-hmm. So you wonder why that behavior doesn't get bred out. And every monkey is like, I'm just going to lay low and not scream and let somebody else scream. And they don't. And humans more so. I mean, humans, we think there's a period in the past where we got down to maybe 800 mating pairs. The genetic diversity between any two humans suggests a genetic bottleneck. And you have to say that's 20,000 years ago. And you have to just imagine how perilous life was then. I mean, we had no cities, we had no walls, we had no writing, we had no knowledge. Humans lived in these little bands of people, highly separated. They weren't the strongest or the fastest or anything. One little scratch, sepsis and die, one mosquito bite, malaria and die, childbirth. And it was just hard to live. Every night must have been a terror. And thunder and lightning must have just seemed frightening. And then you say, well, how did we get through that? How did we get through that? Was it dog eat dog utilitarianism? No, we actually don't. We know that because what we find are the remains of people who clearly could not care for themselves, old people, or people born with something or an injury that were evidently cared for. In a world full of fear with very few people, where life been in a balance, we got through it because we stuck together. If I can tell just one more short story about that. Do you remember this 1972 plane crash in South America with these rugby players?
Oh, absolutely. Alive, right?
Exactly. So plane crashes, and there are a lot of people die immediately. Some people die later. And at one point, about 2 weeks later, one of them, Nando, is listening to his radio. And he heard that they had called the search off for them. They'd been given up for dead. And he ran back to tell everybody, he says, I have some great news. They've called off the search for us. And And people said, why in the world is that good news? And he said, because it means we're going to get out of this on our own. Now, when I read that, I wondered if he really said it. And did he mean it? And why did he say it? And we live in such an amazing age. Within 5 minutes, I had his email address. Sent him an email. The next morning, he answered me. He goes, yeah, that's what I said. That's exactly what I said. He said, I didn't know what else to say. It was terrible news. And but you see, that's the thing is, he was right, because that's exactly what they did. When those rugby players realized there was no rescue plane coming, that they shouldn't sit around waiting for the rescue plane because they've been given up for dead. Well, they only had one other place to look, and that was within themselves. So no plane came in and plucked them up. Those rugby players saved themselves. And so that's really what the book is about. No, there's nobody in the world who's going to save us all, or save the world. We're going to save ourselves, and that's okay, because it's because we're a superorganism. Agora can do anything. Agora can make a smartphone. It can put a person on the moon. It can do anything, but only to the extent that we are willing to work together. And that's what the book tries to get at. It's a science book about this biological creature and why it exists. And that our individual parts in it are no more burden. A lot of people have all this angst. They're not doing as much with their life as they should be. And I think people should move past that. That isn't what's going to, there's way too much weight to carry on your shoulders. Put no heavier weight on you than try to be a little better person tomorrow than you are today, and try to be a little nicer to people. And if we do that day by day, that's really all it takes to build utopia.
So in the argument that you've been giving us, Byron, up to now, it's been explaining kind of this human superorganism in the context of science and biology. But what happens with the influence of the internet and artificial intelligence and all these kind of new kinds of ways of connecting that? How does that impact this idea of a human superorganism?
10,000 years ago, we think there were 8 million humans.
That's not many.
Now we think there's 8 billion humans. So we're up 1,000-fold. Now, biologically, we could have reproduced 8 billion back then. Why didn't we? We didn't because, there wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough medicine. There wasn't enough of any of this stuff. What happened, and that's been kind of the story of this planet, is that it's sort of one of scarcity. And then we learned this trick, and the trick is technology. Technology is just something that amplifies human ability. And that allows us to grow more food and educate more people and do everything. And that's the story of how we got from 8 million to 8 billion, is because we learned this multiplying trick. And one of the big exciting things that's changing right now is almost everything that has ever been known is lost, right? Like for the longest time, we didn't have writing. Writing is only 5,000 years old. And then once we had writing, we only, very expensive. Like we still had Plato, but evidently, Plato's grandma had a great recipe for turtle soup that's long gone, right? Like everything used to die with people. And then we learned how to write, and then we learned how to reproduce that cheaply with press. Then we learned with the internet. And that was sort of where it sat. But if you think about it, search engines still do that thing where you do a search. What's the difference between a cold and the flu? And the search engine says, in a quarter of a second, I found 20 million answers for that. And it's like, well, I actually don't want 20 million answers. I want one answer. It's right. And that's what these LLMs are. They are finally taking this knowledge that has been distributed for all of human history. I mean, we're talking even before us. The storage of knowledge goes back 4 billion years to DNA, 600 meg of storage. Then about 500 million years ago, we got brains, and that was a second place to store information. Then we got speech, which was a way to pass information around. Like that's our story, is about this access to information. And now for the first time, we're consolidating it into one place, one knowledge base, one brain for Agora, one place. And 8 million to 8 billion, we did with all of our imperfect tools. Just imagine what's in store for us next. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be beyond imagination.
Ah, that's fascinating. So let's talk about the impact, or can you give examples of how this human superorganism has somehow organized for societal change and for societal benefit? I mean, do you see historic examples of that?
Yes, the final 3 chapters of the book are called The Past, the Present, and the Future. And the past is really that story about how cruel we were. I mean, I don't have to recount it all. You can read about just how horrific things were 100 years ago and 500 years ago and 1,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago. Just brutal. I mean, we tortured people for amusement publicly. We burned, I'm not going to recount it all. And now, look, the world's full of problems. Like, I'm not saying that. But what we are doing is slowly but steadily, we're creating something we can call civilization. But what it really is, it's progressively learning how to get along better. And that's agora's maturation. I like to think of the Gothic period as agora's Goth phase. And it's growing up and maturing. And so I do think if you reread history, I mean, come on, you have to think, why was it so brutal back then? And you can say, well, people didn't have as much money or they didn't have the education. But then you have to say, well, the kings sure did. They had plenty of money and education and food, and they were as brutal as anybody. And maybe people weren't as smart. And it's like, no, they were definitely as smart. I mean, you had Isaac Newton and all these people. Like, so you have to account somehow for progress without it being about individuals changing, because we really didn't. Right? I mean, we're biologically, we don't evolve that quickly. And so what you can say though is we are in an organism that is growing and maturing. And when you look back at history through that lens, it becomes much more explainable, I think.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. My brain is just lighting up with questions and ideas here. So let's talk about the future then. The idea of agora. How might that shape our future going forward then in terms of social structures and governance and progress and all that kind of thing? Can you think about your concept of humanity as a superorganism and project it forward with some ideas on what that might mean for us?
I think so. I mean, the first question one could ask is, there's no reason it would be 3 levels, right? Do a bunch of agoras come together and form the universe, or something? Like, how many levels up does it go? Is there another organism higher and higher and higher, or lower and lower and lower? There could be. There's nothing magic about it. What's happening is, at a certain level, you have a certain level of interaction, and these 6 forces I write about interplay with each other, and this new emergent behavior, emergent ability comes about, and so forth. There's a man named James Lovelock who coined something called the Gaia hypothesis. And he said the entire Earth and all of its living systems function like a living creature, and that it holds certain things within narrow ranges conducive to life. What does he mean? He means like the salinity of the oceans hasn't changed for 500 million years, even though new salt gets washed into them every day, but there's this folding thing that pulls it under. The level of oxygen in the atmosphere hasn't changed in hundreds of millions of years, but that seems strange because there's more or less vegetation. The sun is getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and yet the Earth in geological time wasn't. So the Earth behaves as if it is alive. Now, he was always unclear, I believe deliberately, as to whether he thought it actually was alive or not, but it doesn't matter. The point is, it behaves like it's alive. And if it's alive, what does it want? Well, presumably it wants what all living creatures want. It wants to survive and reproduce. Well, take that first one, survive. Should it worry about dying? Absolutely. I mean, this planet's going to get hit by a big rock in space. I mean, there's a statistical certainty that it's going to happen and reset all life on this planet. Now, have you ever wondered why there's just us why there's just one intelligent species on this planet. And I know you know you can debate dolphins and all of that, but come on, I mean, there's us, and then there's everything else. And I think it is because intelligence is a very volatile substance. It's very dangerous. One plausible explanation for the Fermi paradox, why don't we see life everywhere, is that when it develops, it blows itself up. Just the nature of it. Most life, 99 point, as many nines as you want to put after that, % of all life has not been intelligent. Bacteria aren't intelligent, and they're going to outlive us all. So you have to say, well, okay, then why are we here? Why is there any intelligent stuff if it's volatile? Well, it could be as simple as this. If Gaia, willing or not, intentional or not, fails to evolve a creature that can protect it, then it's going to get hit by a rock, and it's going to die, and it won't reproduce. But it also suggests that if it evolved a bunch of different intelligent creatures, well, one of them is going to blow themselves up. But it might just be that the Goldilocks number of intelligent creatures is 1. It's still very dangerous. It's still very dangerous, but you need 1 to deflect that rock. You need 1 to protect this planet. And so it says that planets that fail to evolve an agora to protect them die. And that's what we're here for. And then the final thing I will say is there's a theory. There are 2 very mysterious things about life. Well, how did it form so quickly after the Earth cooled? Like almost instantly. And how in the world did it only form once? And we know that because we know all life is related. All life is GTCA, DNA. You can take a gene from a mushroom and put it in a cat and make it glow. One time. Yeah. So you say, why? Well, it could very easily be that it actually was created elsewhere and just landed here. Not like aliens or anything like that. But basically, you could imagine life evolving and filling up the planet and getting smashed by rocks and getting flung into space and landing in the nice warm waters of Earth and immediately starting to grow there until someday it smashes and it spreads around. And that might be how life propagates. That might be how agora reproduces. It may be how Gaia would reproduce, how life propagates around the universe. So my prediction is we will find alien life, but it will be related to us. And what is interesting is that life on Earth, the relative ratios of the elements that make us up do not match the ones on this planet all that well. There are things in you that are vanishingly rare on the Earth, but are relatively common in you, suggesting that ultimately we came from another planet. Now, that's a theory called panspermia. It's not particularly fringe. There's a version of it, directed panspermia, that like aliens, came here and seeded, which is considered fringe. But just the idea that life came on a meteorite isn't particularly out there. But I think that's how universe spread. So in one last sentence, I think that's our future, is we're gonna defend this planet, and we're going to take life to 1 billion other planets, and they're each going to be populated with 1 billion people, each empowered to live their own best life. And that's our big story.
Wow. So those are big ideas, huge ideas. So let me ask you this. Of all the big ideas in this particular book, what was the one that was the most surprising to you?
Well, the hardest chapter to write, the most difficult one, the one I had to think about the most, is if one person smiles at me along the way, I will not jump. It's very easy to take on the burden of saving the world. And it's very hard to see how my little individual letting somebody cut in front of me in traffic leads to that. And that's a hard thing because it's just not the angle we're used to looking at the world through. We see movers and shakers being, like I said, the power people who are doing who knows what, like titans, and that we're all pretty inconsequential. And to get past that and to realize, no, that's not how superorganisms work. They work because all of the parts interact with each other, not because half of the bees are plotting to kill the other half. That is not a healthy superorganism.
Mhm. Wow. So if people bought into all of these big ideas, how would they live their life different?
I have a hard time telling people what they should do. So I would say what I take away from it is understanding that the power of our collective whole, the power of agora, the power to build that smartphone, which no person can do, but it can, that is a mighty power. I mean, like we could deflect it. We could. Like if there was really an asteroid coming to this planet, and we were like, everybody's like, oh my gosh. I mean, it's funny, Gorbachev and Reagan had that conversation. Reagan said, hey, and they both tell this story. Reagan's like, hey, if the aliens ever invade, are we going to like drop this squabble of ours and work together to defeat them? And Gorbachev's like, oh yeah, of course we will. So we can do anything. And I don't mean that in a literal sense, but we can handle almost anything the universe would throw at us, as to the extent we work together. And what does that look like? That's everybody gathering their little bit of nectar and bringing it back to the hive. And to me, it's a very quiet, reflective thing to think about. And it puts a constant burden on me, but a light burden.
Wow. So for everyone out there, the book is We Are Agora. Fascinating book. One of the things that I just love is how bold you are with your thinking, with your open mind, with your ability to collect these big ideas and bring them out there and then invite everyone to find holes in your theories. I love it because you ask in the book, hey guys, I'm throwing this out there because it makes sense to me. And if it doesn't make sense to you, show me why. Love it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.